Welcome everyone, Questini here on Serious Gaming with a discussion about controllers versus mouse and keyboard. I'm making this video as I recently got the controller, and I did so to see how I would handle games like Dark Souls 2, Witcher 3, and Lords of the Fallen with the controller. Games that a lot of reviewers, a lot in the media, and a lot of people have stated where a controller is either mandatory in the case of the Souls series or an improvement versus mouse and keyboard, and I wanted to test this out for myself. Now, prior to this, I had not played with the controller since the NES era, where I was playing Mario. That's the only game I remember playing on an NES right now. And I decided to get an Xbox One controller to test this out. Now, I might regret getting an Xbox One controller versus the 360 controller because the 360 controller apparently is a better one. Like, I don't particularly like the thumbsticks. They actually hurt my fingers initially until I got used to it. Anyway, my experience with the controller, well, initially was terrible, obviously, having not played the controller for such a very long time and certainly not playing with any modern controller. But once I got used to it, once I got used to using a controller, and it took me quite a good number of hours, once I got used to using a controller in Dark Souls to primarily play Dark Souls 2 for the purposes of this video, once I got used to it, it was a lot better, it handled quite a lot better. The default controls for Dark Souls are actually quite good on a controller. Right bumper and right trigger, they are normal and heavy attack or strong attack for your right hand weapon. Left bumper and left trigger are normal and heavy attack for your left hand weapon, or blocking and parrying with your shield. Now, the only problem with this is that with the left bumper, having to hold it down to block is actually not that good. It doesn't really feel that good. I understand why they did this, because they wanted to mirror with the right bumper and right trigger. They wanted a similar situation because you can dual wield in Dark Souls, you can use staffs, all that stuff, but I do feel that it probably would have been better if they had put blocking on the left trigger. Right, so everything was fine, I could handle myself quite well, but my conclusion, based on about 10 hours of Dark Souls and I don't know, about an hour or so of The Witcher 3, an hour or so of Lords of the Fallen, my personal conclusion is that although a controller obviously is quite manageable, I would argue that mouse and keyboard is better for a number of reasons, and these are as follows. First off, far better camera control. Like with the camera, you control it using the right thumbstick on the Xbox controller in Dark Souls, so you have no alternate control node. Use the right thumbstick and use the left thumbstick to move. Now, camera control is much better with mouse because the mouse is far more accurate than any thumbstick could ever be. Now, this is not the problem always, but there are quite a few cases where you do want camera control, and just having that accuracy that the mouse provides is just much better. Now, movement-wise, and this is an argument I see a lot of people use in favor of the controller, is that movement-wise, thumbstick, the left thumbstick, is superior to WSD, but that's not how you control your movement in most games with the mouse and keyboard. Yes, you do use WSD, but you also use your mouse quite a bit to steer your character, and for that purpose, the mouse is just simply better. You can use the right thumbstick to steer your character, but it's just much better with the mouse and keyboard. From my perspective, in terms of being able to steer. It is different. Obviously, you do have better movement with the left thumbstick than with WSD, but you do have better steering with the mouse versus the right thumbstick. So it's a different situation. There's advantages and disadvantages with that, but that's really the smallest issues, smallest of all the issues with the controller versus mouse and keyboard. You can rebind keys. That's a big problem in my opinion. There used to be a lot of games in the past where you could rebind keys. You can't do it right now. Generally, many games give you the ability to switch to an alternate controller setup. Dark Souls doesn't, Witcher doesn't, by the way. Lords of the Fallen does. Of the 3 games that I played with the controller, Lords of the Fallen is the only one that gives you an alternate control setup, but you can't rebind your keys, which I'm not a big fan of, by the way. Like, I really like the ability to set my own keys, but the default controls are quite fine in Dark Souls. But here's the big disadvantage, in my opinion, of a controller versus mouse and keyboard. Like, on a mouse, when I'm moving my character, I can also dodge, dodge, switch weapons, use items, all that, without losing movement or camera control. That's not the case with the controller. For instance, with the right thumbstick, when I want to dodge or run or switch to not dual wield, but to switch to a two-handed grip, use an item or interact with something, I have to move my finger from the right thumbstick to A, B, Y, X, which control all these functions. Whereas on a PC, I don't have to make that choice. Like, the mouse in itself has 3 buttons. It has left mouse button, right mouse button, and middle mouse button. And also, you've got mouse wheel down, mouse wheel up. You can use those as functions, by the way, in Dark Souls 2. You've got that ability there. You know, for a game that doesn't even have mouse and keyboard prompts, you do have the ability to fully customize your keys. There are certain things that don't work, like, say, for instance, using mouse wheel down, mouse wheel up to toggle between locked-on enemies. And by the way, you can toggle between locked-on enemies just flicking the right thumbstick. But there's a mod for that, and you can download this mod in the description below. It also allows you to use the side mouse buttons if you get this mod, and improves the responsiveness, because there's a bit of a responsiveness issue with the mouse. But anyway, the advantage of being able to control your camera and dodge, run, in particular running, gives you a huge advantage. You've got better awareness on a PC with a mouse and keyboard versus a controller, because you can control your camera and run at the same time. And this helps you a lot if you're trying to run past enemies, or you're in a boss fight, or you're in a fight where you're trying to run past an enemy. Like, there's a lot of enemies in Dark Souls 2, for instance, where you can lock on and you don't really have to worry about camera control. But then there's certain enemies, like certain bosses, certain enemies where it's just a better idea to not lock on and just run past them. Like, for instance, I think of the Ancient Dragon boss fight in particular. That would be the kind of boss. Or the first Pursuer boss fight, where you're not trying to fight him in a melee, you're trying to get past him, run past him, line him up with the ballista, and then shoot that ballista. And that's just much easier on a PC, because you've got the ability to run and control your camera at the same time, which you don't have on a controller. On top of that, on a PC, when you're switching items, or when you're switching, say for instance, your right hand weapon, or your left hand weapon or shield, or your spells, or usable items, you do that with the D-pad. You do all these things with the D-pad. You lose all your movement control. Like, you have to move your thumb, press the button, whatever you want to switch to. Whereas on a PC with mouse and keyboard, you can do that without losing movement control, or only losing partial movement control. So for instance, I have set all these things up, like the 4 things I mentioned, on the 1 to 4 keys. Like, 1 switches my shield, my left hand weapon, my left hand, what I have in my left hand. 2 switches what I have in right hand, so on and so forth. And although I have to move one of my fingers from the movement keys, either my index finger, middle finger, or ring finger, I don't lose full movement control. Whereas I lose full movement control with the controller. So that's an advantage on mouse and keyboard versus a controller. Yes, it is perfectly functional. You can get used to it. You can get past these issues. But I would argue that mouse and keyboard is superior. And that's not an opinion, by the way, that I had before I got the controller. That's an opinion I formed after playing with the controller for about 10 hours or so. Yes, as I said, you can deal with this. It's not the end of the world, but it just gives you a lot more options. For instance, like when you're using a life gem, for instance, in Dark Souls, when you want to select a healing item, right? Being able to still move while selecting that item, or switching to a spell, or switching weapons, all that. Being able to still move. Especially if you're not moving your middle finger, which you have on W, being able to move quite fast, being able to run, past an enemy, being able to avoid an enemy quite effectively, that's much better than having to do it while stationary, while just blocking, for instance, or hoping that the enemy won't hit you while you're doing that. So just better. It just gives you better opportunity, better reaction to what's going on around you, and because of the better camera as well, you've got better awareness. So from that perspective, that's my perspective, that the controller is inferior because of these things versus mouse and keyboard. not just down to preference. Like, I actually like the feel of a controller, but in my hands, but I don't like the disadvantages I have, and I don't like the fact that I can't rebind the buttons on a controller, which is quite a shame. I imagine there's mods for it, but then there's mods for pretty much anything, right? There are certain controller mods, like physical mods, that is, which you can get and install on your controller, which will allow you to press the ABYX buttons while you still have your thumb on the right thumbstick. But if we're talking about physical mods, we can talk about high-end keyboards or even mid-end keyboards or mice with a lot of buttons on them that give you a lot more options. So on that level, mouse and keyboard do win. But that's also an option which can fix this particular issue. There is an option for that if you so desire. A lot of people don't use it, however, though maybe they should. It would certainly improve their reaction time if they did so. Now, what about Lords of the Fallen and Witcher 3? Well, Lords of the Fallen, you can set it up, if you go to the Alter and Control setup, you can set up pretty much the same as Dark Souls. So you've got trigger buttons and bumpers, you attack, you block, all that same stuff, right? The thing with Lords of the Fallen is that they decided to have sprinting and dodging on separate buttons, even on a controller. And with that alternate setup, if you want to sprint, and this is quite terrible, you have to hold down the left thumbstick. That's just horrible. Another thing that I neglected to mention, one thing that I neglected to mention with Dark Souls is the blocking. Like, holding down the left bumper doesn't really feel that good. And a thing with mouse and keyboard, an advantage with mouse and keyboard, though this doesn't apply to Lords of the Fallen, it applies to Dark Souls, you've got the ability to lock your guard on PC with mouse and keyboard, not with the controller. I've tried checking, there's no options for this, but you can lock your guard. What this means is that instead of having to hold down a button for blocking, you've got to toggle for blocking, which is much better than just having to hold down a button, even on mouse and keyboard. I personally played through the entirety of Dark Souls 2. I wish I had figured the thing out about guard lock. I figured it out when I was playing Dark Souls 2 for purposes of this video, and I was looking at the keybinds to see, how things are. You've got the ability to guard lock on PC or mouse and keyboard. You have the ability to do it to controller. It just is much better to do it with the toggle than by having to hold down a button. In fact, I wish this option was available to controller, because having to press to hold down a button is terrible in comparison to just pressing a button once and pressing it again when you want to stop blocking, when you want to regenerate your stamina. But anyway, Lords of the Fallen, very similar to Dark Souls, so there's that, with the exception of having to hold down the left thumbstick for purposes of sprinting, which just doesn't work very well, I gotta say. Besides that, no real problem there. With Witcher 3, I'd say Witcher 3 had horrible controls. You've got ABYX, and X and Y are your attack buttons. Instead of the trigger buttons, like in Dark Souls, you've got X and Y as your attack buttons. It's why the fuck would you do it? You're just making it harder for me to attack and dodge at the same time. You're just making things harder for me, CD Projekt. Better on a controller? My fucking ass. If I could put it on the trigger buttons, yes, I probably would handle quite well, but because it's on X and Y, it just doesn't really handle all that well compared to Dark Souls. Dark Souls handles quite well. In fact, with The Witcher, if they gave you the option of being able to attack using the bumper and trigger button, on right bumper, right trigger, that would actually be a lot better. That would actually handle quite well, even in comparison to a mouse and keyboard, because it's not so important in a game like Witcher 3 to have camera control. In the game like Dark Souls, it's important because of the environment, because the way the levels are set up. In Witcher, it's not really that necessary, but I would still argue that there are certain advantages mouse and keyboard have. The Witcher 3 is the only game where I can really think of an advantage of the controller versus the mouse and keyboard, because you've got the ability to toggle between locked on enemies, which you don't have with mouse and keyboard. You just flick your right thumbstick, and you can toggle between locked on enemies, whereas you can't do that with the mouse and keyboard because CD Projekt couldn't be bothered to bind that to the mouse wheel. You can do that in Dark Souls 2. It does require a mod. You can do it by default using the keyboard, but if you get the mod, if you get the script that's in the description below this video, the script that I personally use when playing with mouse and keyboard in Dark Souls 2, you can set it to the mouse wheel down, mouse wheel up, right? CD Projekt can be bothered to do that in their own game, which is quite a shame. So overall experience, although I handled myself reasonably well with the controller, I defeated quite a few bosses in Dark Souls 2, I went through the Battle of Kaer Morhen in The Witcher 3, I'd say that mouse and keyboard is better, and I'd still say that I prefer mouse and keyboard. And mandatory? Fuck no. Yes, it's annoying not to have the button prompts, and I know it's easy for people to say, oh, it's required to play with the controller just looking by that. But Dark Souls isn't that bad actually with the mouse and keyboard. You've got fully rebindable keys. Dark Souls 1 was terrible because of mouse sensitivity, and that's not something any mod could fix. But Dark Souls 2 actually handled itself quite well. Besides a bug that they had a release, an issue that they had a release whereby with the delay in attacks on the mouse, which was only fixable using a mod, but they fixed that issue for Scholar of the First Sin. So yeah, that's all I had to say. Costine here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.